Welcome everybody to the Petersen Automotive Museum, to our online vault tours. My name is Michaela. I'm part of the education department here, and I'll be taking you along with me. Today's tour, we're actually focusing on pre-war American, and so while the vault has over 250 cars in it, our tour today is going to be very focused on some of those early pre-war cars, I should say, because we're going to have some from all across the world. So stick with me. You'll see all of these live streams are actually free online, but there is a suggested donation. All of your donations actually go to supporting this effort and making all of this content available to you guys online every day. So we're gonna get started here in our vault. So come on in. All right, and so it's going to be basically a straight shot through, and we're going to start right here with our Studebaker doctor's buggy, which is actually from 1904. So we're going to start here because this is basically the start of the automobile. Before we had cars, we actually had horse-drawn carriages. And when we started thinking about how are we actually going to power these beyond just using horses, that's when you start getting into steam engines, the early internal combustion engine, as well as battery-powered cars. Now, Studebaker is actually an incredibly long-running company for us here in the United States. They started building wagons in 1852, and they actually got a contract to build wagons for the Northern Army during the Civil War, and that's what allowed them to continue going. And basically, they're going to make the switch to cars around 1902. That's actually their first electric car, and then in 1904 is their first internal combustion engine. So we start here basically because this is what your early automobile looks like. It's basically a platform with four wheels and a seat on it. You put an engine in it and it starts to drive. And if you take a look at the 1903 Cadillac, which is right next to it, this is the Model A, we're not far off from a horse-drawn carriage. You basically get that platform with four wheels and a seat on it pulled by an early internal combustion engine. Now, the Model A was actually designed by Henry Ford. This was the Henry Ford company before it was ever Cadillac. He designed the Model A with a two-cylinder engine in it, and then he spent too much time racing his own cars, and he actually got kicked out of his own company. And they brought in a guy named Henry Leland. Now, Henry Leland was famous actually for creating interchangeable parts in engines. He took three cars, took them apart, rebuilt them using each other's parts, and got all three cars to work. And he actually took it over to Europe, and Cadillac became known as the standard of the world, which is marketing they still use today. So basically, Henry Leland is brought in. He's going to put a one-cylinder engine in this car, rename it Cadillac after the French explorer who founded Detroit, and then he's going to end up selling it to General Motors, and that's going to happen around 1909. Now, he goes on to start another company in early 1920s called Lincoln, and that may be familiar to you guys. Who owns Lincoln now? You might be thinking to yourself, Ford. So Ford gets his revenge in 1922 by purchasing Lincoln and immediately removing Henry Leland. So you have a little bit of early back and forth. Now, as we move down the line here, you'll start to see kind of a shift in the styling. We're moving away from some of those early cars and getting into more of an idea of kind of in the future what a car is going to look like, right? Tires are going to get a lot smaller. You start to see fenders. You have here a little demo Roadster. This is from 1909. If you say Dupont, like it's French, you might think it was a French company. It actually stands for Detroit Motor Company. And they use the French name, the French spelling Dupont, in the hopes that if they sounded French, they might sell more cars. It unfortunately did not work for them. They started building this car in 1909, and they were out of business by 1910. Now, next to it, we do actually have a French car. This is a 1911 Pujo Beibei. So Pujo is an early automobile maker coming out of France, and they actually hired Bugatti, Bugatti, to design this car. And so a lot of people think that this is actually Bugatti's first car. That's not quite true. Hagerty had designed several cars before this, and then basically designed the small Beibei before selling it to Pujo. And little known fact, he was actually going to sell it to Wanderer, Wanderer was part of a company called Auto Union, which was actually 4 separate German companies put together, and Auto Union later becomes Audi. So the 4 interlocking circles for your Audi are actually for the 4 companies that made up Auto Union in the early 1930s. So anyway, instead of selling the Beibei design to Wanderer, he ends up selling it to Pujo. Moving a little bit further down, you have another French car here. This is a De Dion Bouton from 1910. And actually, if you look at this car, you can see where a lot of the styling cues for the Demo came from. De Dion Bouton was building cars kind of before everybody else, and Count De Dion was actually French nobility, and he raced in the very first automobile race ever, 1894 from Paris to Rouen, and he actually won, but he was disqualified because he was driving a steam engine, and that did not count. So you have that early De Dion Bouton there. Moving down a little bit, you get to a Babcock, which is not a name many people are familiar with, and that is because they weren't around for very long. This is basically all of these small companies appear in America in the early 1930s, and a lot of that was because basically Ford is going to make the process of building cars look so easy, and everybody else is going to think that they're able to do it too. And so you get a lot of these small companies, hundreds of thousands of them that come out, like Demo, among others, like Babcock here, and they are going to build cars for just a few short years before going out of business because they won't be able to keep up. Now we have another non-American early luxury car. This is a 1913 Rolls Royce Silver Ghost. Now the Silver Ghost was the first car that Rolls Royce ever built. It was initially called the 4050, and that referred to horsepower. At the time, Britain taxed by horsepower, and so 40 was the taxable horsepower, and 50 was going to be closer to the actual horsepower on the car. Now, all of their cars get renamed after silent things because they're supposed to be silent cars, and so you get things like the Silver Ghost, the Phantom, the Silver Cloud. So you have here a 1913 Silver Ghost, which is basically, it's the original 1913 chassis, and Rolls-Royce was known for their durability. So you could buy the chassis and the engine knowing that it's going to last you for many years, and what you will actually do is just change the coach out as designs change, as styles change, as your preference changes. So this is actually the original 1913 chassis, but it's been rebodied a few separate times. And we would consider this Roi de Belge seating, throne seating basically, where the passenger compartment is actually higher than the chauffeur compartment. And that was named for King Leopold, the King of Belgium, who has a very rough history, but we won't go into that. One more amazing feature on this car is the horn here on the front. So after you find King Tut's tomb, basically, you start to get this fascination with Egypt. So you would honk the horn up here, and it actually comes out the snake's mouth, which is down here on the fender. And it has a little bit to show you kind of what that brass material would have looked like originally. Moving down. Once you move into the 19-teens, you're actually going to start to see kind of a expansion of the automobile industry. Suddenly people are able to produce them, and so what that's going to lead to is a huge expansion in luxury. And so you get one-of-a-kind cars like the Princess Petite Speciale here, which is from 1914. So this is a one-of-a-kind vehicle that would have cost you anywhere near $4,000 in 1914, which is the equivalent of about $100,000 today. And the reason that this is so expensive is because you actually get what looks like chrome plating. We aren't actually going to get chrome until the 1920s. And so this is actually all nickel plating, which was incredibly expensive for the day. That's why we call this the brass era. Brass is the cheap metal to use on all of these features on the cars. Another thing to note about the Princess Petite Speciale, it's one of the first cars we have that's going to be designed specifically with women in mind. So you are seeing really kind of those early styling cues with the beveled glass in the back, the slanted top. You get these very pronounced fenders that are going to protect you from mud. And this is actually a winner for us. It's so unique that we will take it out to a lot of shows quite often. Now that is one end of the extreme. The other is going to be the Model T. So we actually have two here in front of me. We have a 1915 as well as a 1920 Ford Model T. Now, Ford starts building the Model T in 1908. Ford Motor actually starts in 1903. 1908, he comes out with the Model T. He's going to build it for 19 years through 1927. And in that time period, he's actually going to build 15 million of them. So this is going to be the car that changes America. It's going to change the way that we drive. It's going to change how many people are on the road. The other thing is he made these cars very affordable. And the way that he did that was by making them very cheap and by actually buying up all the resources that he needed across lines. So he actually owned a forest in Michigan where he would get his wood. He owned a rubber plant in South America called Fordlandia where he'd get rubber for his tires. So by buying up all of these resources, he's actually able to make his cars a lot cheaper. Now, the way that he was able to build 15 million of them in a short period of time is by using that moving assembly line. So basically you start with nothing, the car moves on a line in front of you, each person adds their part in, and by the time you're finished, you have a finished product. Now, Ford got this process down so quickly, he was able to build a car in 90 minutes. And so what you start to see is every Ford Model T is going to look the exact same because you don't have a lot of room for individualization. If you have a big factory with 10,000 workers and everybody has one part to play, you don't really have space to say, oh, I want a red car, I want a green car, I want to customize this. So what Ford started to do is actually he would market his cars. And you used to get the phrase, you can get my car in any color as long as it's black. So there was a period of about 10 years where you could only get the Model T in black. And what that basically is going to do is kill Ford's sales. He is able to build 1 million of these, but GM is really going to capitalize on this. GM comes out and they start to realize that the consumer wants choices. And they try to offer as many choices as they possibly can. So you have here in front of you a Chevy 490 Coupe, which is from 1922. So just shortly after that Model T we looked at, if you had to choose one, you would probably choose the Chevy, right? Because it's a little bit nicer. You get the same kind of size, same kind of cabin space, but you do have an increase in engine power as well as 4 color options. So you get red, green, blue instead of just black, okay? This is going to be a huge selling point. Now, the other major feature on this car that is going to be incredibly popular for the American public is the fact that it has an electric starter. Up until this point, the early car, you actually had to start by using a hand crank. So it took you about 14 different steps. Part of that was getting down and actually cranking the engine by hand. It was a very difficult, dangerous process. A Cadillac engineer actually died via hand crank. He had stopped on the side of the road one day to help a young woman. He was cranking her car, the crank kicked back, hit him in the jaw, broke his jaw, he got gangrene and died. And so from then on, Cadillac wanted to introduce the electric starter. So they actually come out with the electric starter in 1912. You start to see the electric starter in every Chevy model by 1914. Now, Ford isn't actually able to get an electric starter in his cars until 1919 because he's very resistant to technology change. So you would purchase the Chevy 490 Coupe for maybe $800 in 1922, and your Model T was maybe $400 at that point. So you're paying double the price, but it was worth it in order to afford a little bit nicer car, color changes, and that electric starter. And so that kind of brings us to the end of this section that we would consider early automobile, really starting to get it kind of formed. And now we're going to start to look at the way that people are going to capitalize on building automobiles. And so we are going to look at several branches, and we're going to start over here with performance. Now, as we're walking, you are probably going to see some brand new Ford GTs that we're obviously not going to talk about in this tour, but please come back because we will have a performance tour that will cover these cars. So I may not talk about them today, but we will talk about them eventually. We're actually going to take a look at a supercar in its own right, the Mercer from 1913. So this is the Mercer Raceabout, and it's probably the most original of Mercer Raceabouts from this time period in that almost everything about it, in fact, everything about it is original except the paint. It was repainted once in the 1950s, and that's about it. Now, we consider this an early supercar because as this car is sitting here in front of you, it could get up to 60 miles an hour, which is incredible for 1913. If you stripped it down to bare bones, took the fenders off, took all the extra lighting off till it's basically a platform with an engine on it, you could actually get it up to 100 miles an hour, which is incredible. And this is one of my favorite cars to talk about for this early brass era period because you have several important features on this car. So you would have multiple forms of gasoline lighting. So you can actually kind of see there's a giant spotlight here on the front, as well as these lamps, as well as headlights here at the front. And that is actually, they would be different forms of gasoline. So kerosene lights, acetylene lights, that kind of thing. With the idea being basically, we don't have a ton of roads yet. We don't have pharmacies yet. We don't have gas stations yet because it's 1913. We're still very early on in our infrastructure dealing with the automobile. And so if you're out in the middle of nowhere and you run out of headlights, gasoline for one of your headlights, hopefully someone would have the other form of gasoline available and you could keep going. You also have this giant spotlight at the front because think about driving out in the middle of nowhere in America in 1913 with no roads and no streetlights, and you're going 60 miles an hour. You need to see what's coming ahead of you, so you get a giant spotlight like this. The other thing I love about this car is this monocle windshield. So once you get up past 25 miles an hour, you start to realize there's a lot of stuff hitting you in the face, rocks, wind, bugs, that kind of thing. And you want something to protect you. What I love about this is it's only for the driver. So in a car like this, especially if you're racing, you would have a mechanic riding with you, and that mechanic would just be out of luck. They are just gonna take what flies in their face at this point. Now, the Regal here, because it's able to get up to such speed and it's so technologically advanced for the day, you would be spending close to $3,500 on this car in 1913. Which is why our Regal here, which is the car next to it, was actually known as the poor man's Mercer. So this car you could maybe buy for $900, but you can see they're very similarly styled. They kind of have a similar look to it. And the thing about the Regal is it actually had an underslung suspension. And what that basically means is that it's actually going to take corners a lot better than some of these early cars that we have. And so in its own right, it could have been an early race car as well, although you probably would have been doing some of that customization to it. So that is early American performance. And then we have two more cars over here that are actually going to speak to early European racing performance. And that is going to be our 1923 Mercedes Targa Florio. Now, this was Mrs. Petersen's favorite car in the collection. It happens to be one of my favorite cars in the collection. This is 1923 Mercedes. This is before Mercedes-Benz. So Mercedes and Benz do not join until 1926. So it is Gottlieb Daimler and Maybach building cars for Mercedes and Daimler-Benz building cars for Benz, and they're going to merge in 1926. Now, the name Mercedes actually came from a contractor, designer, entrepreneur who worked with Mercedes early on. Basically, his name was Emil Jelinek, and he kind of commissioned a few race cars from Gottlieb Daimler and Maybach, and he stipulated that they had to be named after his daughter, and her nickname was Mercedes. Now, they decided to end up staying with the name Mercedes because Mercedes-Benz sounds a lot nicer than Gottlieb Daimler, Daimler-Benz, Maybach, which is what it would have been if you had smashed everybody's name together. So you get the Mercedes name from that. Now, this is a Targa Florio car. It was built basically as a sister to a car that raced in the Targa Florio race, which is a mountainous road race through Sicily. It's 3 laps long, but each lap is 67 miles through the mountains of Sicily. And so what you were looking for is an endurance car. This car would have been built to drive all day and withstand, and so it actually features an airplane engine in it. Now, one more thing to note, the 3-pointed star for Mercedes actually stands for land, sea, and air. So they were building airplanes, tanks, and boats for the German army during World War I. Now, as we know, after World War I, Germany's in de-armament. They're not supposed to be building airplanes, tanks, and boats, which doesn't stop them eventually. But early on, basically, they're going to take all of those unused airplane engines and put them into their racing vehicles. So this car actually has a 7.1 liter straight six in it. It's from a Daimler engine from an airplane, basically. And that's an incredibly powerful engine that is actually going to help them win one of these endurance races. Similarly, here you have a 1929 Dupont Boattail Speedster, which would have raced in the Indy 500 as well as the 24 Hours of Le Mans. Now, Le Mans is an incredibly important European endurance race. You're racing for 24 hours through France, and you're not allowed to basically stop. If your car breaks down at any point, you're not allowed to replace the parts. Once you do stop to switch out drivers, your car has to restart from battery. If it's unable to do that, you're disqualified from the race. It's very intense driving for 24 hours straight, and so the cars have to be built to be very durable, very fuel efficient. Now, Dupont is a chemical company. They're actually supplying Ford with his paint. And there's a brief period of time that they're going to start building luxury cars in the 1920s, going into the 30s, and the Depression is just going to kill that side of their business. But they were racing, and that's where you get this car. It was actually originally a race car, and then they rebodied 6 of them in this Boattail Speedster body. Now, there are some features on this car that speak to its road driving instead of its racing, and hint at how luxurious this car is. To buy the car alone, you would have to spend $5,000 just to get it. Then you have several features here, like the wood light headlights. Wood lights are incredibly expensive and they don't work. They're supposed to work like a lighthouse, where the light bounces around inside and shoots out really bright. And instead, all you get basically is a very thin, diffused strip of light. You can't actually see anything with them. So you're really only buying them for name. The other feature we want to point out is our Lalique crystal radiator mascot. So Lalique made 30 different animals that you could put on the front of your car. You would basically just unscrew whatever radiator mascot came in and screw the Lalique crystal on. The eagle is actually incredibly common. We have 3 in the collection here, and we'll see one a little bit later on this tour. But the most rare animal, I think, is the leaping fox. And the animals alone can go for several $1,000s at auction, if not hundreds of thousands. So just the radiator mascot itself was pretty expensive. You would have a light in there that would light the crystal up, and you could buy a color wheel that would sit over the light and spin and change colors and light it up as you drove down the road. So I always like to say that's basically the equivalent of putting neon lights under your Subaru nowadays. But this is 1920s luxury. So these are going to be European racing, and we're actually going to shift over here and get into some of our early European luxury coach building cars. And so what you see is France is really going to kind of pick up the style and kind of define style for the early ages. And so you have here 3 French coach-built, beautiful French Art Deco cars. Now, the French Art Deco style is going to come about in France in the interwar period, so between World War I and World War II. And what you are looking at basically is style inspired by movement, and especially inspired by the airplanes. So you get these big sweeping teardrop fenders that tend to look like airplane engines. You get two-tone paint. You get chrome lines or painted lines all the way down the side of the car that are going to make the car look like it's in motion even when it's just sitting here. So you have here a 1938 Delahaye. Delahaye was basically one of the major French coach builders, and their sister company was known as Lalique, which is actually this kind of bronzy car sitting next to it. And so you have 2 very beautiful examples of these early French coach built cars. The Delahaye, only 10 were built, and there are only like 3 remaining in the world, something like that. It's a very limited number, and this one was actually found under an olive tree in Italy, just kind of sitting there. So it's been restored. Then you have the Delahaye here, and one of the important features on the Delahaye that you have is the fin going down the back of the car here. So that was an added feature on these French Art Deco cars. They're basically trying to play with aerodynamics, make the cars look as aerodynamic as possible, and that's where you'll start to see some of that come in. One more feature here on the car is your tourniqueter or your semaphore. This is a little flag that pops out to indicate which way you want to turn. And that was actually invented by a woman. So was the windshield wiper, and technically the first car, but we won't get into that. Maybe that'll be a different story. One more French Art Deco car we have to speak about is Bugatti. So everyone probably knows Bugatti, especially for their supercars today, but this is actually early Bugatti. They came about in the early 1900s, and they're actually an Italian family, but they moved to France, and so the cars are technically French. And this is Ettore Bugatti, who his entire family got involved with the cars. They're very artistic in nature, very focused on sculpting, painting, furniture building, all of that. And so basically they look at their cars as a work of art. And every early Bugatti was a one of a kind. The chassis would be built by hand, the engine would be built by hand, and the coach would be built by hand. Well, that's not going to make them a ton of money. So when you move into the 1930s, Jean Bugatti, who was Ettore's son, actually took over, and he streamlined the manufacturing process. And so you get the Type 57, which is what this is here. This is a 1939 Bugatti Type 57C Adelante. And basically, every Type 57 is exactly the same, and it's just the coach work that makes them custom. And so the Adelante, they built very few of them, but every Adelante is gonna look different. And so this one, some of the custom features, the red and black two-tone paint, the rollback cabriolet top, as well as the long tail back of the car. And so this is a very unique Adelante. You won't see another one like it in the world. But every Type 57, again, like we said, is exactly the same. So if you see a Type 57 out in the world, its uniqueness comes from its coach building. Now, Americans were also coach building at this time. And in America, the luxury vehicles, you had the 3 Ps, Packard, Peerless, and Pierce Arrow. And so to start, you have 2 Packards over here, a 34 dual cowl Phaeton, as well as a 31 just kind of regular Packard, if you could say it's regular, right? What's special about this Packard kind of in the middle is its creamsicle orange color. And I will point that out right as we move to the Ruxton here, which is from 1929. The creamsicle orange, the two-tone purple, those are factory original colors from this time period. So this is another kind of source of luxury that you could actually get from these vehicles, is by painting them these opulent colors. And that really shows kind of who you are coming down the road. Now, Ruxton came about in 1929. Basically, it's early front-wheel drive, and the design was built basically to make the cars look a lot smaller, a lot sleeker, put them closer to the ground, and the way they did that was actually by removing the drive shaft. Now, Ruxton, the design was intended to be purchased by a major automobile company. No one ever actually got around to buying them, and so they built very few models before basically going out of production. And so there are anywhere between 16 and 19 Ruxtons left in the world today. And so this is a very rare car that you're seeing here in front of you. Now, Ruxton and Cord were both trying to design early front-wheel drive at the same time. And so we actually have a 1931 LE Cord, which is also front-wheel drive. Now, Cord is actually going to beat Ruxton to coming out with that early front-wheel drive design. So this is a later model, but they did end up beating Ruxton to it just by a few months. And again, early front-wheel drive in America was not great. Cord is not able to actually withstand it, and so these cars, they built very few models. But one of the key impressive features on this car is the Eaglehead Lalique crystal radiator Mascot on the front. So I said we'd see another one, and here it is. Now, Cord and Auburn and Duesenberg were all owned by the same company. So you do have, next to our Cord here, a 1933 Duesenberg SJ, which does mean it's supercharged. So Duesenberg is probably the height of luxury in all of these cars here, whereas you're spending maybe a couple thousand to buy any of these other luxury vehicles. With Duesenberg, you were actually going to pay close to $10,000 just to buy the engine and chassis. And then you would still need to take it out to a coach builder who would body it for you. Now our Duesenberg is actually bodied by a company here in Pasadena called Murphy. And they were able to do this beautiful coach body. Now the term, or the phrase, I guess I should say, of, oh, it's a doozy actually comes from Duesenbergs in the 1930s. They had a very easily recognizable exhaust note. And so you could hear when a Duesenberg was coming down the road, and you knew somebody important had to be in it because they were so expensive. So you get the phrase, oh, it's a doozy, because you can hear that Duesenberg coming down the road. Now, we are going to take a look at these three before we kind of pan over to the other side here. You do have another Packard here, dual cowl Phaeton. And this is actually important because it's not just a Packard, this is also a head of state vehicle. And so some of these luxury vehicles you would actually get used by heads of state. Now we're not 100% sure on this one, but we believe it to be Juan and Eva Perón's from Argentina. And it is a dual cowl Phaeton again, so you do get that kind of class separation of the chauffeur in the front and the passengers completely protected in the back. But just a beautiful example of that early coach-built Packard pre-war American luxury. Here in the middle, you do have one of the other Ps of the three Ps I talked about of a Pierce Arrow, and this is from 1931. Again, beautiful paint job on it with the two-tone paint. One of the things I like to mention about the Pierce Arrow is the headlight attached to the fender. So this was pretty specific just to Pierce Arrow. They were one of the first companies to actually start doing this. And this is all hand-shaped metal. So that's where you really get into coach building being an art form. Just like the French Art Deco cars with their rounded curves, all of that is hand-shaped metal that is being added onto the car. And the headlight attached to the fender is really starting to see the fenders kind of be integrated into the fenders. Did I just repeat myself? The headlight being integrated into the fenders, sorry. So basically, you get kind of the start of the automobile kind of becoming one piece. Instead of each piece being added individually, once we move post-war, we will actually see it all be integrated into one piece. Now, one final car we must speak about in terms of early American luxury before we kind of look at some other luxury from around the world is the LaSalle, and this is from 1934. Now, LaSalle was a companion brand for GM. We mentioned earlier that GM really looked for basically as many consumer options as they possibly could. And so with LaSalle, this is the tier right under Cadillac. And so you're actually seeing it as one price point just below, but still luxurious, still very beautifully designed. And so maybe you can't afford the Cadillac, but you might be able to afford the LaSalle. Now, LaSalle was originally designed by Harley Earl. Harley Earl is going to go on to be head of design at GM. He's going to design the Chevy Bel Air, the Chevy Corvette, among other things. And so LaSalle is really his first brand. And I always like to point out this car because you can see it very heavily takes influence from some of those French Art Deco cars. In all of the American cars that we looked at, you get these very rounded fenders, very curved front, and those are going to be features that really play off that French Art Deco style. And so Harley Earl is really taking cues from France early on, and you'll kind of see how his style changes, especially if you watch our post-war history video that I'll be doing a little bit later on. You'll actually get to see the Chevy Bel Air as well as the Chevy Corvette, and you can really see kind of how his style has changed. Moving to this side, we're going otherworldly. You do have the Mercedes Type 290 here. And I guess we were maybe supposed to go a different way, but that's okay. So the Type 290, this is one of the last of this body style. And you can see that this is in rough condition. This is what we would consider preservation mode. Because this is one of the last of this body style, it does not make sense to try to restore it. This car is way more valuable as it is sitting in front of you today. In addition to that, it would be impossible to find parts to replace it. And so the museum often has to make the choice, do we restore something? Do we just preserve it in the mode that it's in? And in cases like this, they will just preserve it and keep it the way it is so that we can continue telling the story on it. Now, the museum generally doesn't undertake that many restorations, but we will actually see a restoration in just a little bit, where you can see where they made that choice to actually bring the car back to its final glory. Now you have here a 1931 Rolls Royce Phantom Boattail Speedster, basically. And this is kind of an interesting car. It's an amalgamation of things. It is a Springfield, Massachusetts chassis. Now, Rolls Royce historically has never built outside of the UK. All of their factories are located in the UK. There was a brief period of time from 1919 to 1931 that they were actually building chassis in the United States, and that was taking place in Springfield, Massachusetts. So they opened a factory, and the reason they did that was because they had a huge demand for the Silver Ghost and the Phantom One from Americans. And so they opened this factory in order to keep up with that. So this is a Springfield, Massachusetts chassis, excuse me. It does, however, have a boat-tail body on it. Now, this would have been done in an imitation of a style that was incredibly popular in the late 1920s, early 1930s, called the Laborde skiff, where someone actually took a skiff body and put it onto a car, and so you get that boat body. Now, traditionally, the Laborde skiff did not have any doors, and on this car, you can actually see there is a door here on the passenger side to be able to get into the car. And so what you're seeing here is actually kind of an imitation of that style, and it was done by a boat builder who actually is still around today. So this was a recent rebodying of this car. And so it is an attempt at a style. It does work. However, it's not entirely the most accurate bodying. However, this car was purchased by Cleo Shelby to add into the collection of Carroll Shelby, and so it belonged to them. And it is an important part of the Rolls Royce story. Behind me here, you have a Ford Model A Woody wagon. So if we go back to our Ford story, you have the Ford Model T. He is very resistant to chains, to improving that car. You come out with the Chevy 490. Chevy starts to outsell Ford about 2-to-1 at that point. And so Ford's son Edsel actually convinces him that he needs to update, to innovate, to bring about change. And so that's when you actually get the introduction of the Model A. Now what this does is it adds about 20 horsepower to the Model T engine, so you're going maybe 60 miles an hour instead of 40, and you add 4 color options, where basically you can choose red, green, blue, and black. So you still have black as one of those choices. Now, this one was done as a Woody wagon. Like we said, Ford owned a forest. It's not uncommon to see cars before the war bodied in wood, because we actually didn't have the technology to print sheet metal large enough to wrap around the entire car until after the war. And so what you were seeing basically is a station wagon. And the term station wagon actually comes from before the World War I, when we were still using carriages. If you arrived to a new town by train, you would pull up there and there would be a wagon waiting for you from your hotel. And that was known as the station wagon because it showed up to the train station. Well, once we start to get larger cars that can fit multiple passengers, you do kind of see the term station wagon move over to cars like this. And the station wagon is going to become an incredibly popular family car because families start to see it and realize, hey, my 6 kids fit in this, sell me one, and the station wagon is born. On this side, a few more things we'll probably just point out before we finish up with this beautiful Rolls Royce here. 2 more beautiful Rolls Royce here. What you have a Avion Voisin, another French company coming out during the interwar period. And Avion Voisin, the family name was actually Voisin, and they used to build airplanes. So avion in French is plane. So they make the switch over to building cars, and they were actually using a sleeve valve engine, which is an incredibly silent engine to use. Unfortunately, because of the way that the engine is designed, it actually requires a lot of excess oil. Well, that oil would start to burn off, the engines would start to smoke, and it would look like the car was about to break down. So Avion Voisin did not make it very far. They don't even make it to World War II before they go out of business. And so like many other coach builders, they are going to kind of fall prey to the war, to depression, that kind of thing. You have in the middle here a 1922 Leach. This is actually an LA company, and it's another example of cars that are coming out of this period. and where everyone basically thinks that they can build cars and very few are able to do it. This may actually be one of the only surviving leaches in the world. And so it's a very rare vehicle, but not one that you may be familiar with. And then one more luxury vehicle from the time period, you have a Nash here from 1929. Again, two-tone green paint, so you get some of that really audacious styling. You can see the details of the beveled glass on the side mirrors. And one more thing about this car, with coach building, you could do anything you wanted to do. And so the man who owned this car wanted to hide the fact that he golfed a lot from his wife. And so he actually had a compartment hidden back behind the trundle seat for his golf clubs. So you could slide a pair of golf clubs in there and go to the golf course and no one would ever know. So all the little things you could pay for if you wanted to. Now we'll finish up with two more Rolls Royce, I believe. So here in the middle is a 1927 Rolls Royce Phantom Town car. This is basically the height of luxury for this time period. So you do really see that class separation. The passenger compartment is completely enclosed, weather protected, silk interior, silver finishings, vases for flowers. Meanwhile, the chauffeur barely has a roof or any protection from the weather. And there is a one-way speaking tube here in the corner. So the passenger could actually tell the chauffeur where they're going and the chauffeur cannot talk back. Now this car belonged to Fred Astaire. He actually purchased it while over in Europe and had it brought over to the United States, and he would be chauffeured around in it pretty much everywhere he would go. On the back here, you actually have a original Louis Vuitton luggage trunk. So this is where the term trunk actually comes from. You would have your trunk placed on the back of your car. Once we start to build cars the way we think of them today, you have space for your luggage to go inside, and that becomes known as your trunk. Now this Louis Vuitton case, as much as I know, which I've never actually seen it open, so maybe one day, it does have his top hat, shirt collars, a cane, and possibly his tennis racket. So now keep that car in mind, and we're gonna finish up with probably a crown jewel here in the vault, which is our round door Rolls Royce, which started out as a 1925 Rolls Royce Phantom Town car, which is why I asked you to keep the Phantom Town car back there in mind, because if you take a look at this, it looks absolutely nothing like a Phantom Town car. So this is a 1925 Rolls Royce Phantom Town car chassis, rebodied in 1934 by a coach builder in Belgium by the name of Jonquier. And it's beautifully done in that French Art Deco style. So you get these big teardrop fenders, sweeping round doors, chrome details all the way down the side. You have a 15-inch fin on the back, as well as this slanted grille here at the front. So beautifully done as a show car. Now, this car has had 15 different owners throughout its life. And originally it was owned by Anna Dodge, who's the widow that inherited the entire Dodge brothers' fortune after they passed away. She purchased the car, she didn't like it. It was sold to the Raja of Nagpur, so it was actually in India for a period of time. Rebodied in 34, moved to America during World War II in order to avoid destruction from bombing, and ended up in a New Jersey junkyard where it was sat basically untouched for 20 years. Purchased by a man named Max Obie, who painted it gold and toted it around America, claiming it was the King of England solid gold Rolls Royce, and charged people to sit in it and take a picture. And you can see it has a matching luggage set here in the trunk. So basically, even though, oh my God, scary. Even though you would want to sit in it, want to ride in it, you have matching luggage, you might want to take a road trip in it. The car weighs about 8,000 pounds and it has a 100 horsepower engine. Very small engine, so it takes a long time to get up to speed, takes a long time to stop. So really it was just built to be in shows. And the Petersens actually purchased this car in the early 2000s and undertook all of the restoration work on it. Decided on this beautiful black paint color here. And now it is one of our crown jewels here at the museum. Now, I think that is going to bring us to the end of our pre-war American tour, Please come back and watch more. We'll have several other themes, including post-war history, as well as hot rods, performance, Hollywood, politics. You can see behind me, there's a whole bunch of content out here that we will be covering over the next couple of weeks. So please come back. If you're interested, please make a donation. It will really support us as we go through this time. And I guess be safe, be healthy, and we'll see you next time.